Welcome to Hercules. Welcome to the Canadian Opera. Welcome to the BMO Financial Group Student Dress Rehearsal. What this means is this is an actual working rehearsal. We are going to be working. You're in the middle of everything happening. Sometimes the singers may not sing out full. Pictures are happening. It's a total scene. Please find what you find in the process. I really want to welcome students. I also want to welcome veterans and presently serving members of the Canadian Military Forces. Welcome, 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 welcome. Thanks to the Memory Project, thanks to the Canadian Royal Regiment, thanks to the Canadian Veterans Advocacy Group, and of course thanks to the Toronto EMS. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight what we're showing you is not an opera. It was written in 1744 by a composer, George Frederick Handel, at a particular moment in music history and in the history of his own life. He had run an opera company in London, lost his shirt 3 times, and finally couldn't bear to continue working with the British aristocracy as his primary audience. Together with a group of forward-looking friends, they said, what we need in this country is democracy. All they had was Mad King George. And they said, okay, if you're going to imagine what democracy could be, democracy can't just be the lowest common denominator, and it can't just be, we hear from the people who have the most money. It has to be that we hear from people in their finest selves. The very finest thing that people want to contribute to a public space. And that means we have to speak from our very deepest emotions without falsifying them. And so they created the form of oratorio in English, where we speak about very difficult topics with as much love, power, and skill as possible to create a safer public space that begins to be a democracy, where we can all say to each other things that are hard to say, which is why the arts exist. It's called art because you have to do it with skill. And it's like telling your dad something he doesn't want to hear. It has to be done with love, but also with courage. Sophocles was one of the creators of the Greek theater 2,500 years ago. Handel in 1744 took a play written by Sophocles and created something that was contemporary for his audience in England. In fact, the play written by Sophocles 2,500 years ago was part of the power of Greek theater, which is what the Western tradition of opera is based on, which is basically, in order to vote in the Athenian democracy, you had to be a man. In order to speak in the Senate, you had to be a man. In order to be a citizen, you had to be a man. Meanwhile, they understood that theater was necessary to maintain democracy. And so they built a giant amphitheater on a mountain on the edge of town, the world's largest listening device, where 5,000 people could assemble with perfect acoustics, and you could hear the voice of one person. Because democracy was about deep listening. Not just listening to what somebody's saying, but listening to what they're not saying. Deep listening. The name, if the Athenian City Council bought your ticket, if you couldn't afford it, everyone who voted had to attend the theater. And the theater was where we discussed painful topics, like how we treated the prisoners in the last war. Children killing their parents, parents killing their children. The kind of things you can't just pass a law, you can't just have a judge hand down a decision. They're human questions, and we have to treat them together as humans and as a humane community. You can't legislate that there will be no more suicides. You have to recognize, where is this coming from? And we all have to work on this together. In this Greek theater, the name of every single play was the name of people who couldn't speak in the Senate, i.e. women, children, foreigners, and slaves. And this is the place you heard the voices that you didn't hear in the Senate. And you heard them speak through music and through poetry. So what they said went deep and wasn't just propaganda. And it created something to discuss. Handel took this Greek theater as his model, which is what we're hopefully doing today in the largest theater in the middle of town, getting together a cross-section of people to talk and think and feel about things we're all facing. Here in Canada, the last troops came back from Afghanistan this weekend with a lot of feeling, a lot of memories, a lot of thoughts, a lot of questions, moving forward and moving back. The sacrifice of the military life is something that Sophocles understood well, because he's the only great playwright who was also a general. And so he wrote powerfully about military honor and military dishonor. What it meant to be pursuing a war that people don't agree with, what it meant to be doing something that maybe isn't helping, and what the specific costs for the soldiers are, and then for the communities they're returning to. Sophocles' play is called The Women of Traches because it's not about the soldiers who left, it's about the families who stayed. And it's about the toll on the families. And it's about the original post-traumatic stress. Handel understood post-traumatic stress very personally. He had several complete mental breakdowns. He constantly had to be treated, and this was a non-scientific age he was living in. And for Handel, he understood that one of the only treatments for traumatic stress may be music. Music that helps you unwind, music that helps you breathe, music that lets you live with your emotions, music that gives you perspective, music that has some kind of compassion running through it, music that hurts, but in a sweet way. And music that takes you into the unbearable place with light and tenderness. Handel's mental collapses were pretty ferocious, and the score is, you can see where there's these blots of ink and the pen right through the paper and just tore it up. And you watch him struggling not to lose it. And he writes music for people who don't want to lose it. This evening ends with people in mad scenes, truly losing it, but trying so hard not to. For Handel, his musical language was something called the da capo aria, which begins with one sentence, which is repeated 25 times, which is how our minds work and how our hearts work. There's one incident that just goes over and replays over and over in your mind, and you can't shake it. Then the next section of the aria is a completely contrasting idea, which is fine, I'm over it. And then it writes in the score, da capo, go back to the beginning and start over. And the 25 things you told yourself you were over, you're not over at all. They come back weirder, more ferocious, and pushing harder. And of course, the main image of post-traumatic stress is traumatic moments which keep coming back whether you want them to or not. And you don't know how to take the exit ramp. This experience just keeps returning and returning and returning, and you're processing it every way you can, but you don't know how to set it down. And it doesn't let you alone. Inside these arias, there are melismas. It's a single word. When Hercules first comes back, he sings, the god of battle quits the bloody field. The word battle, he can't even get out of his mouth. Handel has an explosion of 45 notes. And you get the shrapnel and concussion inside one word. The word battle. When his wife tells him maybe it's time to retire, the word retire has 50 notes in it. She can barely say it, and every part of it hurts the man she's saying it to. And Handel's musical language is about how deeply impacted certain images and certain ideas are, and how explosive they become. And you think it's just a word, and no, the word explodes. And you realize people are carrying this around. This incredible depth of feeling. But meanwhile, trying to act normal all the time. In the case of this opera, the title character Hercules, who's the strongest man in the world, invincible on any battlefield, loses his life in his own living room. Because that's the one battlefield he is lost. Handel gives him 3 arias. His wife has 13. Which right away gives you one of the aspects of the violence we're talking about is so many people come home and don't talk. And inside that silence is a lot of violence. And so often, people who are serving don't want to let loved ones at home know what they're going through. And meanwhile, the loved ones at home don't want to stress the person who's serving and say, your kid just got kicked out of school today. So what happens is neither side exactly told the other side what was going on. And then at the homecoming, the soldier says, don't you have any idea what I went through? And the answer is actually, we don't. And the family says, don't you have any idea what we went through? And the answer is, we don't. In those silences, in that space of non-communication is where the violence breeds. The misunderstanding. And you watch in this piece, it's a tragedy because the definition of tragedy is people trying to do the right thing and the wrong thing occurring. Because people didn't know how to love, how to direct their love, and what the real obstacles were. The music is wild, crazy, these high-end strings taking you in all these shapes that give you the way the human mind is just moving at this incredible pace. And at the same time, I love opera because opera is by definition slow. And so it gives you the quiet, spacious perspective to just let something sink in. Let your emotions gradually come back. Let your thoughts gradually come back. Let your mind wander. Wander in a deep space where all these things are occurring, all these memories are coming up, all these images are moving. It's poetic, it's metaphoric, and it's real. It's a dream, because that's what opera is. But of course, the deepest things in our lives are dreams. And things we have deep, deep, deep down, somewhere back there, somewhere up there, that are really hard to access. And opera is about the window. Obviously, in the United States, at Fort Hood yesterday afternoon, we have an unbearable, painful situation where specialist Ivan Lopez, whose best friend said, here is a man who is humble, obedient, complete integrity. One of the finest people I've served with. Opened fire on more than a dozen people yesterday afternoon. What we're talking about isn't on the surface. We're talking about what is moving below the surface. what is moving invisibly that's near all of us. And that's why the arts exist, why there's literature, why there's music, why there's poetry, is let's get below the surface. Let's get to a place the politicians don't go. But the human heart goes every day. And let's find a zone of peace there. And meanwhile, recognize what people are carrying around with them. And start to figure out how to deal with it more humanely, more creatively, a lot more creatively. Finally, I should just say, the piece itself was made with such high idealism. And I hope it's the opposite of television and most movies, where violence is used very gratuitously and, in a way, very exploitively. And where we're trying, again, with the project of opera, to go to another place, where it's not the violence, it's looking inside it and through it and coming out the other side. What's powerful about Handel's generation is they were bringing something into the world called the Enlightenment, which is, excuse me, in dark times we need some light. And in fact, the light comes from every human being, and the light is shining from your heart in the darkest times. That's the real light of the world. Sophocles wrote this play, and it ended in a bloodbath and in suicide. In 1744, Handel said, we can't keep doing that. And so the final aria of the evening is my heart with tender pity swells at sympathetic woe. And I behold the suffering where heaven has struck the blow. And it's just an invitation to each of us to open our hearts a little more. And your heart is being given this gentle expansion through the gift of music. Thank you so much for coming. Have a beautiful night.